All right, if you're just joining in, we're starting the recording now and we'll be getting started in just a couple of minutes. Thank you so much for taking some time out of your day and joining us for this important conversation. We really appreciate it and we do not take that lightly. Welcome. Hello, Annie. Hello, Kelly. Hey, Barbara. All right. Welcome, everybody. And thank you so much for tuning in to the first Coburn Conversations of 2024. I'm Tracy Clark, Director of Supportive Services for Coburn Place. For those of you who don't know, Coburn Place offers compassionate care and safe housing choices for survivors of domestic violence and their children. While we serve everyone, most of our clients identify as Black women. We are committed to supporting them with efforts to reduce the stigma of mental health issues in the Black community. We're expanding opportunities for survivors and their kids to access the services they need to heal beyond domestic violence support groups. This looks like counseling referrals, mindfulness and yoga programs, fitness classes, art therapy, and more. In partnership with the Indianapolis African American Quality of Life Initiative, we are happy to introduce our friend Hazel Owens to talk about the effects of multi-generational trauma and systemic racism on Black mental health. Hazel is a licensed marriage and family therapist, owner of Owens Counseling and Consulting Services, LLC, and an associate pastor at Common Ground Christian Church. Welcome, Hazel.
Well, thank you so much, Tracy, and thank you, Coburn Place, and welcome all of you. I'm so excited to partner with you in this way and spend this time with you all. So we're going to jump right in. We have a short window of time to talk about a really big topic, okay? I am going to vacillate between sharing my screen and not sharing my screen so that we can have this dialogue. I believe Tracy and some others are going to help with filtering questions to me. And so if you have questions, please put them in the chat. We will answer questions throughout the conversation instead of me doing a presentation and holding them at the end. So please feel free, Tracy or whoever is emceeing the questions, to interrupt me or interject at any point, because I do want this to be as conversational as possible. Okay. Are we good where I could go ahead and begin sharing my screen? Okay, I see a head nod from Tracy, so I'm going to take that as a yes. All right, just one moment, please. Okay. Okay, because I can't, hold on one second. I can't see everyone, but can you see this? Actually, Tracy, I see you, so.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. All right, so again, my name is Hazel Owens. I am a licensed marriage and family therapist and owner of Owens Counseling and Consulting. Today's chat will be around multi-generational trauma, racism, and Black mental health. To get us going, I will have a brief conversation or just spill on how the flow of today's conversation is going to go and the posture that I hope that we're able to hold as we engage with this topic. We'll talk about definitions around intergenerational trauma. We'll also get into very little a theory called post-traumatic slave syndrome and how that can impact Black mental health, as well as systemic racism and the effects of that on Black mental health. As we begin this conversation today, I truly want it to be just that. So you have opportunity to ask questions in the chat. Tracy and some others will help filter those questions, and we'll engage those questions throughout the presentation. The other thing that I just want to name is that there will be words and there will be possibly images or even phrases that will come from this presentation, or even from questions that may activate us a little bit. And so I want you to, one, honor your body, okay? So if you find yourself feeling a little activated, maybe your heart rate is starting to increase. And right now mine is, because I am a little nervous, but I'm excited about this conversation. But if your heart rate is starting to increase, or you're starting to feel tightness, whether in your jaws or your shoulders are starting to raise up and you're feeling tight, maybe you need to take a moment to do some deep breathing, maybe step away for a second, but please join back in. There may be some things that are shared that will cause activation within you that may force you to want to completely disassociate from the conversation or to distract yourself. This is where I am asking that we try to engage a muscle of intensity, as Dr. Ken Hardy, who's a marriage and family therapist, would call it in his racial trauma work. Because this is a conversation that I believe many of folks who are on here, you're here because you want to learn more, or because you're already doing this work and it's your jam, or whatever the case may be. Let's engage that muscle of intensity by trying our best to stay present in the conversation, but also please feel free to honor your body and what it is that you need, okay? All right, so let's just jump right into some definitions. We're going to talk primarily around intergenerational trauma in the Black community. Again, many of the things that I would say will be at a very high level. There's a lot of nuances to this topic. Black people are not a monolith, and so our experiences with this type of topic is different amongst each other. So I'm speaking at a very high level, generalized sort of way, just to get us going in the content here. So we'll start with trauma. Trauma is an emotional response to a distressing event or experience where it is difficult to process or emotionally digest the stressful experience. It could be one incident, or it could be an ongoing event, right? So some aspects of trauma could look like domestic violence, sexual abuse, neglect, natural disasters, environmental stressors or traumas, those sorts of things. Again, it could be one incident, it could be ongoing. So that's trauma in a nutshell. When we think about trauma as it pertains to generations and intergenerational, is that the effects of that trauma is passed, it has impacted one generation, and then it has passed through the generations that come after that initial onset. So this typically takes in the form of two ways: historical and collective. So historical trauma affects cultural, racial, or ethnic groups. The symptoms of that traumatic event is passed through the generations thereafter. Oftentimes those symptoms are felt, but they're hard to explain or to describe because the subsequent generations were not present when the trauma occurred. It passes through a process called epigenetics, where basically the parts of our DNA begin to change. I'm not going to go into epigenetics because that will send me on a whole other path, but this is how it shows, it transmits itself through the generations, and it's through our DNA. We'll talk about later the effects of chattel slavery and how that historical traumatic event has transpired its way through the generations of Black Americans who are descendants of those enslaved Africans. The other way that this shows itself is through collective trauma. And this is where the intergenerational trauma has affected a large group of people or societies. So think of 9/11. If you ask anyone about 9/11, they can remember exactly where they were when it happened. what they were doing, whatever the case may be. Oftentimes they could even remember the feeling that came over them, or whatever the case may be. Images will bring back that memory, those types of things. And now we are also enduring this in COVID-19, right? So we're now in an endemic of that, but that too is a form of collective trauma that can pass its way through the generations coming after. So these are things that affect a large group of people or a society. All right, let me try to move on. Again, as we frame our conversation, when it comes to intergenerational in the Black community, this is, I'm not saying that this is the only type of intergenerational trauma that impacts the Black community, but what I am saying is that oftentimes its roots take hold through the historical event of chattel slavery, where enslaved Africans were kidnapped from their land, brought to this land through very harsh tactics of abuse and what I would call psychological erasure, where colonizers were literally using tactics to not only try to erase the enslaved Africans' culture and identity, but also the memory of their land, Africa, right? And so then there's, of course, subsequent traumatic effects that has happened throughout that history. One of the ways that this shows up in Black Americans who are descendants of those enslaved Africans is through internalized oppression or internalized racism. This is where stereotypes of one's own ethnic group begin to take its roots in oppressive beliefs that is harmful to that group, right? And so we start to dish out, if you will, those beliefs onto the same folks within that shared ethnic group. So, and for oftentimes Black Americans, it shows up in something like colorism or texturism or featureism. This is where physical attributes that are closer to white are deemed more acceptable. It's deemed more presentable or beautiful in nature, right? So this Western white European standard of beauty becomes a norm that is birthed out of racism's white supremacy, and then it gets internalized in this particular ethnic group, right? So amongst the Black community, you'll hear things like, oh, you know, light skin versus dark skin, or good hair versus bad hair, or those types of things. If you have a wide nose or a smaller nose or big lips or plate lips or whatever the case may be, these depictions of one's own physical appearance as being something less than because it is further away from what is deemed as acceptable, that has been shaped and formed by white supremacist views of what beauty looks like. Another way that this shows itself is through respectability politics, right? So this is a belief that behaving a certain way makes a person more valuable or makes them more deserving of respect or dignity. Oftentimes it can show up in ways of where you know, I'm going to talk specifically about Black folks. Black folks are in certain spaces or whatever the case may be, and they are surveillanced in how they are presenting themselves. And then the dominant culture or white culture gets to say what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. And so when a Black person within the Black ethnic group behaves a certain way that is deemed unacceptable to the white standard, then this internalized oppressive or oppression or racism begin to show up in maybe named stereotypes or put downs or what have you amongst one's own people group. Does that make sense? Okay, it's kind of tricky to explain. Okay, all right. So sometimes it shows up in derogatory terms or put downs, right? So where one is being accused to assimilating to some form of whiteness, being called an Uncle Tom or whitewashed or talking white, like whatever that means. And so those associations of whether it's a certain level of education or success or what have you, is rooted in a narrative of racism and white supremacy that suggests that these white standards, whether it's of beauty or of education or success or what have you, is only deemed for that particular group of people. And part of that issue that gets kind of repeated is that the lack of representation in those areas. And so oftentimes when my clients speak like this, I have to help them reframe that narrative that it is not them, it is systemic racism that says that you can't achieve or attain or what have you, right? And so but when we do this amongst the culture group, it can show up as a form of one's own internalized oppression and racism. And then the other, another way that this shows up is just completely disassociating from one's own Blackness or ethnic identity because of the exhaustion and fatigue or the believability that these narratives and standards that have been formed out of racism is what's right. And there's something defective within oneself. And that takes a toll on one's mental and emotional well-being over time. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit. All right. Another area where this trauma shows up in the Black community is in our health, right? So race-related stressors and its impact on impacts of racism, also the accessibility to food and healthcare, the physiological implications that this tends to manifest itself, whether it's in, I'll talk more about this later, whether it's in, high blood pressure or diabetes, aches and pains, those sorts of things. So oftentimes, and you may hear me repeat this, my clients may come in and they can identify weird aches and pains in their body before they will be able to identify any like emotional distressor or would even correlate the ache and pain to some sort of mental or emotional distressor. And then it's even harder to be able to name and describe how possibly racism could show itself up and be a contributor to that particular distress or illness that is happening mentally and emotionally, which we'll get into some of that here in just a second. So as I went through that rather fast, I want to pause and just check in to see if there's any questions and how people are doing so far.
No questions here.
Okay. So we're all on the same page. Everybody's on board. Okay. Tracy, you got something?
Just one in the chat, just talking about it. I think you're going to touch on this down the line. That's why I was pausing on covering how you get out of this mindset. And yeah. I'm hoping you're going to touch on that. Yep.
Yeah. And I can actually touch on it here and just quickly. It is a definitely one of the things that I get to do as a therapist is to help reframe that mindset, right? And so helping my clients to realign those narratives, right? Where did they come from? There are times like I'll use a personal story. My mother is very fair complected. And oftentimes people are really confused on her ethnicity because they don't know. But she is very much a Black woman. She's just very, very fair complected. And so growing up, I would find myself in a lot of arguments and fights because my skin is much darker. So I must be adopted is what I would be told, or whatever the case may be. But it wasn't until I began to develop language for why these assumptions are being made, or the way I talk, or whatever the case may be, where these narratives get rooted in, then I can reframe that narrative, that this is not my narrative. This is not what I impose upon myself. It's what has been imposed upon me that takes its roots through all the way back to chattel slavery. We're going to talk about in this video that I'm going to show appropriate adaptation, right? And sometimes we behave in ways to adapt out of survival to whatever situation that we're in. And so how do we get out of this mindset? It is educating ourselves, developing some awareness of where some of these narratives stem from, and actually reframing the narrative and putting it back on where it was rooted in the first place. And it's a repetitive thing. And plus, of course, counseling and all of that can help as well. So I hope that helps the question a little bit, and the rest of the presentation would kind of pull some more of that out. Okay. All right. Checking the time. Okay, good. So let's go ahead and switch gears a little bit. I want to talk about post-traumatic slave syndrome. There's a book by Dr. Joy DeGruy. If you have not heard of it, have not read it, I highly recommend it. So she is a social worker by trade, researcher, and she developed this theory to help us out with understanding how this really does impact not only us physically, but mentally and emotionally. But she defines post-traumatic slave syndrome as a condition that exists when a population has experienced multi-generational trauma resulting from centuries of slavery and continues to experience oppression and institutionalized racism today. Added to this condition is a belief, real or imagined, that the benefits of the society and in the way that they live, I have a typo there, are not accessible to them. So not only is there this multi-generational trauma that has been passed through the generations, remember, through epigenetics, so now it's like in our DNA, resulting from centuries of slavery, oppression, but also the way in which racism, institutionalized and systemic racism, has manifested itself throughout the centuries, even today. It just looks different, but it's still very much present. And so because of that you have now this condition or this belief, again, whether it's real or imagined, that the benefits that the larger society have, that if I'm a part of this ethnic group enduring this type of trauma, I don't have access to them. And oftentimes it is real. And then there are times where it is imagined, right? It's a both and. And so when we're up against that, whether it's ourselves personally or we see it through other people who look like us, the trauma symptoms come back, right? And so even in the form of microaggressions that Black folks can experience, it's not about that one incident. It becomes a history of all the other times that this has happened, which taps back into this condition here, okay? So to further talk about this, I'm going to stop share for a second. I want us to watch a short video by Dr. Joy DeGruy that talks about multi-generational trauma and post-traumatic slave syndrome. So give me 1 second. Let me share my screen again. There may be a little bit of a lag, but hopefully everyone will be able to see this and hear this just well.
Post-traumatic slave syndrome is an explanatory theory that really looks at multi-generational trauma. one of the things that's difficult for people is their first response. Oh my God, that happened so long ago. We're talking about people being captured, shipped, sold, beaten, raped, experimented on. And then you have to ask the question, did the trauma continue? Yes. So 300 years of trauma, no health, free, no health, more trauma. If it's a sustained trauma, then the impact of that is also sustained. When we look at multi-generational trauma, we're looking at people who are maybe victims of natural disasters and their families and their children, generations of folks who have experienced war. And we know that there are residual mental, emotional, traumatic impact. And what I did was I started to look at the African-American experience, starting with slavery as a real clear, long enduring traumas. I started to see that there were clear connections between that survival behavior and contemporary living in African-American experience. I started to see common behaviors that I took for granted as well cultural. There's adaptive behaviors, survival behaviors. Well, what are they? Let's just say 2019, you have a Black mother and a white mother. The sons go to school together. They find themselves at a meeting. The Black mother leans over to the white mother and says, I just wanted to mention to you that I noticed that your son is really doing quite well. And the white mother's response, oh, thank you. She begins to go on and on about he won the science fair, his uncle's an astronaut. She's just oozing. She realizes the Black mother's son is actually excelling. And she says, wait a minute, your son's the one that's really coming along. And the Black mother responds, oh my God, he's a handful, but oh, he just works my nerves. Now, when I'm working with African-American people, it doesn't matter what the audience is. It doesn't matter what class. If I were to ask, is she very proud while she's saying those denigrating things? And everybody laughs and goes, of course, there's a secret. Because everybody Black knows that even though the Black mother is going, oh my God, she's really proud. So now let's roll that seed back 300. And let's say this Black mother is working in the fields and a white slave owner comes through and says, wow, that boy is really coming along. What is she gonna say? No, he's not. He's stupid. He's shiftless. He can't work because I don't want you to sell him. So I denigrate them to protect them. That is called appropriate adaptation when living in a hostile environment. The little white boy, say Timmy, you know, he feels really comfortable and happy about what his mom just said about him. And Trey looks at his mom and wonders, why can't you be proud of him? Because he doesn't understand the secret yet. And by the time he learns the secret, he will have already been injured by it. Post-traumatic slave syndrome. PTSD is a disorder that occurs as a result of a single trauma. You don't even have to be there to actually get a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. You could just hear about something horrific happening to someone you love. So you have people who have experienced it firsthand, people who have witnessed it in their environment, right? People who are continuing to be oppressed. That exacerbates any possibility of healing. So it's not post-traumatic stress disorder because then it becomes part of what we call your socialization process. So you begin to normalize a way of living and being, everything from what we eat to what we believe it means to be a friend. You know, all of these things are colored by history. And if you don't understand it, you're going to fold in things that you've just assumed are normal. But post-traumatic stress disorder, you know, exaggerated startle response, outbursts of anger, feeling of foreshortened future. There was a point where there were African-American children in different urban settings that didn't expect to live to be adults because they saw so much death that they started planning their funerals like at 13, 12, as young as 10. When you start looking at the simple biology, you start looking at the impact of stress on health. And while we look at general stress, you know, finances, you have illnesses, all these different things. How about being Black? How does factoring in being Black in America impact your stress level and therefore your body's ability to operate its own immune system? Because we know it compromises the immune system. Once you understand it, then you can deal with it. Because you see, it's habitual. You socialize. It becomes part of your being. So one of the ways you begin to address that multi-generational trauma is to work with the people it directly impacts, to hear from them. And when you give the people the information, they can use it. I think the first order of business is beginning to have a conversation. And the other is to educate the larger society. You have to stop the assault. So this is not purely a clinical thing. This requires social justice and change. That's where part of the healing is. It's not in a clinical setting or in a pill. It's in fairness and justice and safety and equity. We got to work with some of those clinical things, some of those issues of panic and anxiety. And we also have to deal with the fact that you have a system that is set up to oppression and to continue to injury. Both those things have to be dealt with. And they cannot singularly by themselves affect a child. They have to be done collectively.
Okay. Stop the video. Before I share my screen and go back to the presentation, I think this would be a good time to do a check-in. What thoughts, questions, curiosities, comments do you have so far, whether it's about what we just saw or anything that has been said before?
This is Tracy. I have a comment.
Yes.
I'm at Coburn Place. I had read or saw in a documentary before about Black parents and how they raise their children as a form of protection to have them fit in with the current society during the Jim Crow era. And then I started thinking about it. As an African American, I could see how my parents did that with us as their children. And I can see how I've incorporated some of that with my kids and grandkids, because it is a way of protection and survival in a society that you don't quite fit in with.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I resonate with that too, Tracy. You know, in my studying of this so far and, you know, just working with my clients, like I too see how my mother and other caregivers have done that out of a way of protection. I think one of the things that, you know, in the Black community, we hear, I'm hard on you because the world is going to be harder, right? And it's out of that survival, it's out of that protection, because we are still under a system that continues to injure. Yeah. Any other thoughts, questions?
I agree and agree with Tracy as well. And I think that what that really opened my eyes to is the fact that you don't know what you don't know. We don't even fully understand, even as Black people, understand how much the trauma has affected us down the line. And I think that as we start to understand, we start to put into practices different things that will really help us get out of that mindset, as someone mentioned earlier. And it's still uncomfortable. I know for me, accepting compliments for my children, I forcefully smile and say thank you. And it's very uncomfortable. But once you acknowledge that, you can kind of just start practicing something different. Viola said, what about the Black mother does exactly what the white mother says, and then the other Black mother treats her different, saying she thinks her kids are better than the other Black kids?
Yeah, Viola, that's a very good point, right? I think that goes back to the point that I made around internalized racism, right? So why is it that teaching our kids emotional ways to emotionally respond that are effective, right? Or complimenting our children, or doing those things where they're able to share in a respectful way, or whatever the case may be. Why is that deemed inappropriate for Black people, but appropriate for white people, right? Well, again, roll the tape back 400 plus years, right? If that Black mother did that in chattel slavery, their child could get sold, right? And so so there's that protection that's there, but it's a really hard, especially within our own community, when we do that to each other. And that's where that reframing of the narrative has to come into play as one way to try to navigate that.
And I believe Viola wants to speak. You can feel free to unmute yourself as well.
Good morning, guys. So my question, a little bit more on my original question, was because I started with 3 boys, and I raised them to believe that they are kings, because they are. and they're all educated. 2 came out at 16, 2 are entrepreneurs. And then I finally have a daughter late in life, and I had to change the way I think. So, but now to this day, my oldest is going to be 36, and people still think that our relationship is weird because we have an open communication. We talk about everything, and they always want to know my opinion because that's how me and my husband raised them.
Mm-hmm.
Our culture still thinks that that's weird to this day. You know, they think that there's something wrong with that they're not supposed to talk about their feelings. And if we keep stifling our young men, there's going to be a problem. What can we do to get not just our culture, but any culture to understand that it is totally acceptable and totally okay that we discuss everything with our children to give them the best life possible?
I think, you know, one of the things here is that you're attending conversations like this, you're engaging in conversations like this. It's a heightened awareness that has to be developed, right? Not only for our own community, but for the larger society as well. Again, we are under narratives that are very large, what I would call dominant discourses in our society that is rooted in racism, right? And so therefore, unfortunately, there's this believability in many of those narratives. So when you're doing something that is outside of what a cultural norm is, right, whether it's helpful or harmful, there's going to be some sort of resistance to that, right? And so it's going to take continuing to, one, do what you're doing, because that's what works for you and your family. Again, we're not a monolith. And it's about the education, the heightened awareness, and continuing to engage in these types of dialogues.
I agree with that. I was saying that we have another question here.
Yeah, I was gonna say, can we take a couple more, and then I want to make sure I get through the rest of
absolutely
the size, and then we'll wrap up with a few more questions.
Absolutely. Okay. And I just wanted to say that is definitely, I understand what the other person who just asked was talking about, when it just comes to how do you really work through that and become more acceptable, and just reminded me of a quote that the more you show up in your authenticity, the more you invite other people to show up in your authenticity. So just being you and doing the things you've done and just showing up that way invites the rest of the community to say, oh, she's doing things differently. Oh, maybe there's something over here. And I think the more people that show up like that, the more it really helps. Cynthia, I'll let you ask your question, and then we'll save the rest for after.
Okay, I can wait till the end if you prefer.
Yeah, it's okay.
Okay, thank you. I'm Cindy. I'm a child special advocate with Kids Voice. And I have a question about when I'm with teens and I see that they denigrate themselves, or if I may be observing a parent doing it, what is something that I can do to interrupt that narrative or to turn it around without making them feel uncomfortable because of my skin color? And also just so that there's just something that I can do to kind of pivot it so it starts a different voice in their head.
Yeah. So I think you know, in your situation, one thing I would suggest is get curious with them about what they're saying, why they're saying it, what have you. I know that there are times where even culturally we joke with one another in ways that may not feel comfortable to other cultures. But like remain curious instead of assuming or rushing to assume that it is a true denigration, or that you have the solution, right? So get curious with them. Why do you say these things to one another? How does it feel when folks say things like this? If someone else was to say this to you, how would you feel, right? Or whatever the case may be, because they may not even know that this is harmful in some way. Where do you think that came from, right? You know, and just have a dialogue. And so that would be probably the first thing. And then if there is like again, you want to be careful too, because I actually had someone ask me a question like that with some children that they are raising. And, you know, I'm like, okay, you have rules and what have you, or boundaries in your household. That's that. But we got to understand where the languaging is coming from and what are you meaning when you say these things, and what is the impact you're trying to have when you say these things to one another. So you got to ask and massage a lot of questions, especially someone in your position, and to really get to the root of what's really happening at play. Is that helpful? Okay. Can I jump in on some other stuff? I see my colleague and buddy Buana and has his hand raised. Buana, do you have something real quick? Or...
No, that's okay. It's no, it's okay. Do your thing, Miss Hazel.
Okay. All right. Well, let's hop back into the presentation real quick, and then we'll circle back around for more questions. Okay. All right. So one of the things that in my work, I often say that, and I love that Dr. Joy said this too. I mean, we have two things at hand in healing this generational trauma. We have a system at play that continues to oppress that we have to be aware of, right? So I am not here assuming that everyone on this call does what I do. However, you are working with the largest society and working with diverse populations. And so you have to really tap into just how this system, this oppressive system, plays itself out amongst different ethnic groups. So there's that piece. But then some of these wounds do require clinical attention to be able to help reverse or stop some of this from being passed down. One of the things that I say to my clients often is that if trauma can be passed through the generations, then so can healing. So we have a lot of work to do. We have justice work that needs to be done, and we have healing work that needs to be done, and they both have to be done hand in hand. Okay. So impact of racism on Black mental health. Now, I borrowed these definitions from Mental Health America. I like these definitions, so I'm just going to go through them really fast. I'm not here to teach you all about racism. I imagine that many of you know and have heard of some of these definitions, but racism being a term combining with a combination of race-based prejudice and power. That is one thing. Anytime I'm talking about racism, it is prejudice plus power. Okay. Those two are in combination. And without that, the power differential, one person, group, institution has more power than the other. Racism is just prejudice. It carries less weight and fewer consequences when that group of people don't have the power. Okay. So when we talk about racism, I am coming from this definition that it is power plus prejudice. Okay. Systemic and structural racism has three components with history, culture, and institutions or policies, right? Historical racism provides the framework for the current racism that we experience today. Any structure built on a foundation, history of racism will be a racist structure. Culture is ever present in our day-to-day lives, is what allows racism to be accepted. It's what allows racism to be normalized. It's what allows racism to be perpetuated. And then there are many institutions and policies in our country, and even possibly in some of our corporations that have this fundamental relationship and rules that reinforce racism and gives it its social legitimacy. And so that's what makes it really hard to dismantle. I'm going to skip to the next slide because I really want to talk about racial trauma and reverse racism. And so I'm passionate about this because oftentimes when we're talking about the effects of and the impact of racism on Black mental health, the DSM-5 does not give you any information on this. It's gonna somehow code itself in some form of PTSD or whatever the case may be. There's nothing that talks about racial trauma. And it is indeed trauma. So it's traumatization that results from experiencing racism in any of its many forms, right? So this doesn't have to be one isolated event. It can be a accumulation of experiences and daily subtle acts of discrimination or microaggressions. Those, I had a woman recently, I kid you not, in a predominantly white space, felt the liberty to just come up and open up my jacket to read my shirt because she didn't get a good look at it. Well, who gives you the right to just come and touch any part of me? And so those subtle ways of microaggressions can instantly bring back all of those traumatic memories. And then if you take it 400 years back, the lack of agency of your own Black body in a real sense, right? And so that gets activated and stirred. The other thing that I want to make sure we highlight is this quote idea of reverse racism. It's a made up term and it shouldn't carry any actual value. I love this direct quote here. It's a term created by and for white people who want to perpetuate racism by denying their privilege in all its forms and by claiming that fighting to improve the lives of BIPOC individuals is somehow racist against white people, right? It is impossible because of the lack of power. Remember, racism is power plus privilege. And so white people have historically always fallen on the powerful side rather than the powerless side, even if you yourself was not there in that historical event, right? I was not there in that historical event, and yet I still feel the effects and the symptoms of intergenerational trauma that is impacted by racism. And so there it is. Okay. I'm gonna pause myself there because I'm short on time and I will get on a tangent. So let's look at real quick some of the effects. So like I said earlier, it's often masked as PTSD symptoms due to no real diagnosis in the DSM-5 that will recognize race-based trauma or racialized stressors. Another way that this shows up, we just had, I think it was a couple years ago, the APA issued out an apology for the many years of misdiagnosing Black and brown individuals with diagnoses that did not fit whatever mental condition or illness or stressor that they were under, right? So oftentimes, Black folks in particular are misdiagnosed with things like schizophrenia or bipolar disorders or what have you, when maybe they're dealing with some form of major depressive disorder, or maybe they're actually dealing with racial trauma and some combination of the two, right? And so those mixed diagnoses is also a result of the ongoing healthcare disparities that are here in our country. There's a saying in the Black community that when white America gets a cold, Black America gets the flu, right? Because we're not going to get the quality of treatment that we deserve because of the impact of systemic racism in our healthcare system. This translates over into environmental trauma as well, and accessibility, right? Food deserts and lack of resources being poured into certain schools or whatever the case may be, all stemming from the effects of systemic racism. So then what do we see? Higher rates of depression, anxiety, and chronic stress. Chronic stress. The problem with this too is that there's no really, there's statistics out there, don't get me wrong, but it is also hard to do research because for very good reasons, we Black folks are not going to just let anyone do research on them. We've been tested and poked and prodded on and abused by the healthcare system. So even the stats can be a little skewed because of systemic racism. So it goes back to, those daily or even those daily occurrences, right? That happens and gets perpetuated it then shows up in physiological illnesses, diabetes, heart issues, high blood pressure, weird aches and pains, trapped anger, right? And anger is not a bad thing, but then Black folks can't express their anger because then that will lead to a stereotype that once again is fueled by racism, narratives of racism, right? That stems from racism, I should say, which then goes back into self-esteem issues, internalized racism. It's like a vicious cycle. And then chronic fatigue. I hear clients say, you know, I'm exhausted. Being Black is exhausting. And what I help them say is no, dealing with racism is exhausting. Because you're Black, that's not it. It's the racism that you have to endure that's exhausting, right? So those high levels of fatigue has other implications that, again, the mind, the body, and the spirit are all intertwined, right? And so when one is affected, it also affects the other. Okay. That's it for right now. Any questions, any comments about anything that was presented?
And we have a couple of hands. I think we'll start with Buana if he still wanted to speak, just because he had his hand up prior to. And if he stepped away, we'll go to Jody.
Hello. My question is probably a little bit different, but I think that this is a wonderful topic, and I found it so informative. So I work with individuals who are trying to quit smoking, and there is a huge disparity in smoking, and especially with the marketing in menthol cigarettes to the Black population. And smoking is actually the #1 most preventable cause of death in Black Americans. Even though they start smoking later, they smoke less cigarettes a day, and they're more likely to try to quit. There has been the ruling that menthol is a flavor and they need to stop making those cigarettes. But Biden has not signed that executive order for that to happen. How do you communicate with someone that these are I don't even know how to phrase it, but these are oppressive things that are happening, and not like, oh yeah, I got to smoke these for a few more months, but the people are taking advantage. They're unfairly marketing to you because of these things. How do you express that?
Well, I think in just how you expressed it here, right? So, you know, I think sometimes in certain spaces we are really uncomfortable with talking about racism and systemic racism and the way in which that it shows itself up even in policies, right? Like what you just described. And so one is figuring out, okay, is this uncomfortable for me to talk about and why, right? And then two, navigating that discomfort a little bit. Because again, what I hear from my colleagues, especially my white colleagues, is I don't want to project that on my clients if that's not what it is. But you know that's what it is. So it's not a projection, and there's a way to present that in a more curious stance. Like, have you considered how systemic racism has impacted what gets marketed to you and as a person living in a Black community in this particular socioeconomic demographic, what have you, right? Like, there's a way to do that and to name that without being very intrusive and like, hey, you know that's racist, right? Like, you don't have to do that, but there's a way to present that, right? But I think the first thing is to figure out, am I uncomfortable with talking about this, and why am I uncomfortable? If I know that for this to be true and I see how this has shown itself, what makes it uncomfortable for me to say this to this person? And you got to deal with that first, and then go ahead and present it as educational material. Now, what they do with it, that's on them, unfortunately, but at least you have presented the information and shared it out there.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Hazel, for sharing that. I see that we have one more question, but I know that a couple of people have to get off in the chat there. And I just wanted to chime in before we see if we have time to answer one more question. And just thank you guys, every one of you, for coming and joining this conversation. This is absolutely the start, and I'm honored to be able to be in this room with people that are interested in learning more, how they can work together and really create change. Thank you so much, Hazel, for taking out your time to explain this topic and talk about this topic, which is absolutely a tough conversation. If you all want to hear more, you can. This Saturday, guys, this Saturday, Hazel and Coburn Place, we will be at the IBEW Local 481 on Saturday, March 2nd from 11 a.m. to 2 p.m. And we'll be talking about this exact topic. So you can talk in person. If you have more questions, we'll definitely answer questions at that time. We'll be providing free lunch, and we'll also have a space for kids to hang out as well if you have your little ones. We also ask that you all complete a survey that's in the chat. So if you have just a couple of more minutes, we're going to drop a survey in the chat. And if you can complete that, that will absolutely be wonderful. And we really appreciate your feedback. And lastly, guys, but very important is, again, we are expanding opportunities for survivors and their kids to access services beyond domestic violence support groups. This looks like counseling, referrals, mindfulness, yoga programs, fitness classes, and art therapy. And we do this through our health and wellness program. So Coburn Place is currently hiring a health manager for the health and wellness program. And the link for that will also be in the chat. So if you know of someone, or if you are someone that would be interested, please take a look at that as well. And we would love to have you be a part of our team. I think we have 3 more minutes. So Madeline, if you want to chime in with your question, we would love to try to get that answer before we sign off. And you would just unmute yourself. You are muted.
And if Madeline stepped away, Buana is back on.
No, she's here.
Okay.
I just had to unmute myself. Yep, she's here. So anyways, I am with Partners in Housing. And of course, you know, when you're in housing, you talk about systemic racism and post-slavery traumatic. I got it all. I have it all. So right now, one of the things that we're struggling with is basically, like you said, services for the residents, not getting connected, not having their health being taken seriously, having to go to the, I hate to say these, facilities where they're just a number and not a person, and not having their concerns being heard, not getting connected with the community, especially on the mental health side of things, where there's no case manager, and literally they dropped them off into an apartment and gave them no tools to work with to be able to maintain their own, to be able to maintain living on their own. And now we have these residents who I'm trying to find case managers for, if indeed there are some, or maybe not any at all. That's a problem. It's a huge problem, because the resident is unable to live on their own. So what do we do?
Yeah. Man,
how do we figure this out?
Yeah. That's loaded. I mean, but what you're experiencing is real, unfortunately.
Yes, it's very real.
And I wish I had a quick short answer for that. I don't, unfortunately. And there are individuals that Buana actually I was going to mention him. He put his stuff in there. He is the owner of a wellness center called Morning Star that is geared for African Americans through the Flanner House. And so that's one resource there. But I do think that part of this issue too is that we don't have enough folks who look like us in the field.
Nope.
Working in these areas. And that in itself is also part of systemic racism. Right. And so we're talking about, you know, something that is so bigger than us. But I think the more that we can have conversations like this, the more that we can connect with one another, about the services and the various services that we provide, right? And also talk to others about the things that we do, others who look like us, to help promote these types of programming that folks can go and get educated, get whatever they need to do to enter into the field. And so, yeah, I wish I had something quick for you, Madeline, but I don't. I hear you. I'm holding that. And then Vonna dropped his resource in the chat as well. So
thank you so much. I'm sorry, go ahead, Madeline.
I was gonna say, she said he dropped his stuff in the chat.
Yes.
His information, you said it was in the chat?
Yes, ma'am. Yes.
Okay, I'll try and get it there and see if I can get some connection, because I've got a project I've got to work on now and I'm needing his help.
Yes. Yes. And Bonna's here. So if you hang tight, maybe we can just have a minute to let Vonna.
Oh, great. I can hang on for a minute.
And I just want to respect time. I know that it is 1, so if anyone has to sign off, then that's no problem. Hazel, did you want Vonna to speak, or you want to go ahead and close out? Because I know
if Vonna could just share really quickly, and then we could close out.
No, but Hazel, do your thing. I'm okay. I'm here to support.
Well, you put your resource out there, so can you just share it out loud?
For sure, for sure. So Morningstar African Wellness Center, we're at the corner of 23rd and MLK. We are under the Flanner House umbrella. All people are welcome, 5 years all the way up all the way up. And we specialize in providing culturally competent, culturally relevant services. So we are super excited and to provide services to Black and Brown folks in a way that they are comfortable and able to receive it. So if we can be of service to your clients, your neighbors, your family, we have 8 qualified therapists, both male and female, who are willing to walk with you.
Thank you.
This is Khadija Grider at Partners in Housing. I have a question. Do they have to come to your location, or can you come to us?
Beautiful question.
Yes.
We do have a brand new facility, but no one is required to be there. So we are more than happy to come to where clients feel most comfortable.
Okay, so me and Madeline, or primarily me, since I schedule everything at all the properties, we're going to reach back out to you so that where you can come to some of our properties that's much needed, so people can center themselves back to where they need to be at.
Absolutely.
Yes.
That's bclements@flannerhouse.org. bclements@flannerhouse.org.
And
Okay, thank you very much.
In the chat, and Haley has pinned it, so you can grab it from there. Tracy, thank you so much. And Rachel at Coburn Place and Haley, all of you guys, thank you all so much for having me this afternoon. And thanks all of you for joining in and hanging in 3 minutes late. So Tracy, I'll hand it back over to you.
That's it. Thank you again, Hazel. And thank you guys for joining. Be on the lookout for more Coburn Conversations in the future. And you all have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thank you.